Hey developers, today we're looking at Vue.js, Angular, what is better? Okay, so let's take a look at Vue versus Angular. If you don't know, I'm a huge Vue.js fan, but I also use Angular in my everyday job. So I just want to talk to you guys about some of the things that are different between Vue and Angular, some things that are the same, and then let you decide by the end of the video if you should use Angular in your next project or Vue. And just to let you know, things have changed quite a bit. I know a lot of people have used Angular 1 back in the past. So I am talking about the latest version of Angular, Angular 11. On top of that, I actually created an app using Angular 11. If you're interested, I created a full Pokemon app where we can retrieve Pokemon, list them, uses a lot of neat innards for Angular. It's a very good app if you're just learning Angular. So if you want a full, basically hour-long introduction to Angular, click on a link in the description below. And also, I went ahead and created the same app in Vue.js and in React. So I'll put a link to all those videos in the description below if you want to check those out. And as always, if you guys like these type of videos, make sure you click that like button and subscribe. And I'll put a link down to my mailing list, which you can go ahead and subscribe to if you're interested. And I will update you when I have these new videos out and some cool things and courses that I create. So let's just dive into this. Now, this presentation is kind of a combination of just information, but it also show screenshots. So I'll put links below. Also, if you want to look at the timestamps and jump around, that is fine. So let's begin. So here's what we're going to cover in our presentation. First, we're going to look at the CLI. So there is a command line interface. There's a tool that used to generate both Angular and Vue projects. We're going to talk about the differences and similarities between the two. We're going to look at the file structure and basically what's it made of, like what things are made of out of Vue and Angular. We're going to then look at routing. Then we're going to look at components, kind of the building blocks of all these different libraries and front-end frameworks, always components. So there are some distinct differences between Angular and Vue, and we'll look at that. Then we're going to take a look at some examples of grabbing data from a server. We'll look at displaying the data, kind of the ease of use, and then I'm going to give you my final kind of what I think between Angular and Vue and if you should use one versus the other. Start with CLI. So there's basically lots of options in the Vue ecosystem. With the CLI, in the CLI in particular, it allows you to select state management, unit testing, linters. It basically has a whole menu system when you use the Vue CLI to ask you what kind of app you want to create. So it's pretty powerful. There also is a really great plugin system that it has, which means that if you want to bring in Tailwind or if you want to bring in something else, it'll install it, and it also installs some configuration for you. So it's a little bit more powerful than using an NPM library. It actually does some configuration, and they're made for Vue. And also there's really cool things like Vue UI. So if you did not want to use the command line at all to create your Vue project, you can use Vue UI, and you can also plug your Vue UI into existing Vue projects and then use that to add more plugins or add and delete things. And it also has some nice features where it gives you the bundle size. It's a pretty cool little app kind of built into the Vue ecosystems and using the Vue command line interface. On the Angular side, it does include a more of a generator system. So it does have the CLI kind of reminds me a little bit of the Ember CLI back in the day, if you remember that. But you can easily use it to generate your components, your services, your all your different types of TypeScript files. And we'll talk a little bit more TypeScript in the future. It also allows you to add, it does ask you a few questions when you first generate an app with it. With the Angular CLI, you can add routing, you can add SCSS out of the box, and there's a few command line arguments you can give. So between the two, I definitely Vue has a lot more options, a lot more things you can do. So here's a quick screenshot of both. Now I'll move my head out of the way. So you can see here on this one, this is the Vue one in the top left-hand corner. So as soon as you create an app, it's gonna ask you, first it even asks you, do you want to use Vue 2 or Vue 3 preview? And you can use Babel, TypeScript, Progressive Web App, Router, Vuex. So it kind of gives you a lot of really cool options. And especially this is neat if you're a beginner and you're just trying to learn Vue for the first time. You don't have to worry about okay, I need an NPM install this library and then I need to go into this configuration file and add this. It's all there for you. Then in the Angular side, you can do ng new create app. It gives you a couple more options. Fewer options, but it allows you to it does ask you if you want what style sheet format you want to use. So you can use SCSS, CSS, Sass, less. It also asks you if you want to add routing. So it definitely a lot less options. for you, but it does have the generators. So once you get it up and running, you can use a generator to create your components and services in TypeScript, and because they do have quite a bit of boilerplate. And so that is a nice feature. You can also roll your own generators, I've heard, just like you could roll your own Vue plugins and add-ins, but I haven't messed around with that. But I would definitely say, in my experience, the Vue CLI is easier to use, but they're very similar. Let's take a look at the file structure of both an Angular app and a Vue app. In Vue, we have components, we have directives, we have mixins, we have props and slots. We have custom events, we have routing and state management, and we have single file components. So there's a lot of things in your file structure. So obviously components are the building blocks of your app. That's just pretty common. But then you have these directives, and these are things that are added into your HTML elements to give you like for loops and if statements and things like that. Then you have whole mixins, but that's where you can like copy code and kind of share it between multiple components. There's a whole system of sending props and slots to different components. So if you want to pass things into a component, you might use a prop. If you want to pass things between the opening closing brackets of a component, you would use something called slots. Then there's ways you can transfer information from a child component back to a parent component with custom events. There's a whole routing state management, and then all the files, your HTML, your CSS, and basically the JavaScript is in one file, and that's usually how you create Vue apps, and that's called this SFC, the single file component. Well, on the Angular side, and by the way, if you're confused right now, don't worry, I'm going to show you some screenshots. They'll make this less confusing, but you have components, and then usually you have three files. You have an HTML file, a CSS file, and a TypeScript file, and that's usually that's the way you use inside Angular. So you have three different files, and you kind of you switch between all three. But there's things called services, which is kind of a lightweight way of sharing information between components. There's this, obviously you have complete TypeScript out of the box. It's not an additional add-on like you have to add it in Vue or React. You have modules, which are like files that you have to keep track of everything in your app. And you have to, every time you have a new component, you have to add it to a file or new service. You have directives like Vue. They are different. While most of the Vue directives start with V dash, the Angular directives start with like NG star. So they are a little bit different. And that's also kind of similar to Angular 1 if you've used that. Then there's RxJS, which is a way you can stream information. We'll talk about that more. And then it has like a lot of batteries included. So there's a lot of stuff that's built into the Angular library that you can pull in, including forms, HTTP clients, title services. There's a whole bunch of things. So here's an example on the left-hand side of what you might see in a Vue app in the directory structure. So we have assets, we have this router folder, and we have these views where we have our components. This is it. And inside each one of these are single file components. So you have all your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, this is like a typical Angular file system where we have this components folder. I went ahead and created this about folder and home folder. And then each one of these I have in my individual CSS file, my individual HTML file, and my TypeScript file. So they're three separate files. Now you can combine them into one, or at least you can combine the TypeScript and the CSS and CSS into one file. There's ways you can combine them, but typically you leave them into three different files. That's normally what you do on the Angular side. There's also models too. Since we are talking about TypeScript, you can create your own interfaces, and that's really typical in an Angular app that you'll have like a models or interfaces folder where you put all those things in there, or sometimes you can even create classes that you want to share. So let's talk about routing. Routing is really advanced in both Vue and in the Angular and basically in the React. All these different frameworks have done a really good job at routing, and there's only like some advanced cases where you're going to find some issues. So routing, like child routes, dynamic routing, I'll move this back down, like dynamic routing, lazy loading. Routing, you have child routes, dynamic routes, lazy loading. So those are all built in. On the Angular side, it's really the same thing. You can have child routes, you can have dynamic routes, lazy loading, but lazy loading is a bit more complicated because now we're dealing with modules, and then you have to worry about like pointing to different modules. So here on the left hand side, you could see here's the like a Vue, typical Vue route, where you have the route here, home component, and then you have the slugs. So this is the different path here. And then right down here, you see lazy loading right here. You do this import statement, and this will do code splitting for you. So this route will only get loaded when you actually go to it instead of being loaded as soon as the app loads. Now on the right-hand side, this is a typical Angular route that you see. You have this route, and then you have the path and components. So it looks very similar to Vue, but what might be a little more confusing is you have this ng model, annotation here at the bottom, and you have the imports and exports. So that's definitely a lot different than you might see in the Vue world. And if you're doing lazy loading, or lazy loading, you're gonna have to create multiple modules, a little bit more of a complicated system, but they're very similar. All right, let's talk about components. So components. Components in Vue are single file, so you both have your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are all in the same file. There is a couple of ways you can create your components in Vue. Right now with Vue 3, there's something called the composition API, which kind of looks somewhat similar to maybe in the React world when you have hooks. Sort of similar to that, where you have the setup function and you can do everything inside that, and you can easily import in other functions. And there's also something called the options API, which is more typically what you see in Vue 2 apps, and you can easily use them in Vue 3 as well, where you have this like data object and you do everything inside this export default. With components, we have props. Props are ways we can pass things into components. We can also check those props to see if they satisfy some sort of condition. So if we want to make sure they only accept numbers, we can do that. In Vue, we emit events back up. So that's how you can kind of communicate from a child component back to a parent component. And then we have slots, which are ways to pass data from the inside, the opening and closing brackets of a component down. And there's even ways you can like pass stuff back up. It gets pretty crazy. In Angular, you have these at input and output decorator inputs, but basically they're fields like on your classes that you would use to basically specify what it's expecting. So on an input, sort of like props, but you have to define them just like you have to do props in Vue. It's quite a bit different. And once again, we're looking at, since we're using classes, we're in this object-oriented programming paradigm. Outputs are ways you can emit events back. You have like an event emitter that you can emit events back from a child component to a parent component. It has this idea of dependency injection. When you need to bring things in like services or special third-party libraries, you would use dependency injection that puts it right into the constructor of your class inside Angular. You have a lot of, once again, object-oriented programming classes and constructs you can extend. You can do everything you can in a normal object-oriented programming way inside Angular. By the way, they also have a way you can pass information in between the opening and closing brackets of a component, and that's using ng content. It's kind of like slots, and there is ways you can do a lot of things with it. So here on the left-hand side, you can see here, this is the composition API in a Vue 3 app. There's this setup function here. We have some state. We create this reactive object, and then we have this fetch statement where we grab data. This is sort of like you would see in a normal Vue application. While in the bottom right-hand corner, this is more typically what you would see in an Angular app. So you can see here, this has this constructor here. We have this router, which is kind of built into Angular, where we can get router information using this is basically dependency injection. We can get this HTTP client, and then we have observables. We'll talk about RxJS a little later. This ng on init is a lifecycle hook that gets started soon as the app loads, and we can set different things. So this is very different. And then once again, we have this at component decorator at the top, since we're using classes, that tells it a lot of information about where to find these files. And we basically tell it where the template URL is and where the style URL is. So we already talked a little bit about this, or we showed them that last screenshot about data. Vue, if you want to grab data from a backend, you can use whatever library you want. Now, storing that data is a different issue, but let's just talk about grabbing data. You can use Axios, or you can just use fetch if you want, and then usually assign it to like reactive data properties inside Vue. Now, on the Angular side of things, they have a built-in set of tools. There's a whole HTTP client library built into Angular, and those use observables, and you can use that to do HTTP client operations. On the top left-hand corner, this is like a typical fetch function where it returns a promise. It's thenable, so we can grab JSON from it, and then we do display data, and we can do whatever we want at that point. On the bottom right-hand corner is a typical way of handling data inside an Angular app. So use the HTTP client library, which we pulled in from the dependency injection from the constructor. You're using TypeScript, so be able to get types out of it. So this is type Pokemon, which is an interface that I created. Once again, I actually created a whole video on doing this in Angular. So like I said, if you want to learn more about it, you can click on the description and read about it. Then I use this pipe operator, and this is all RxJS here. So I'm plucking. I'm basically grabbing the first result that has the name results in it. I'm using this tap, which is great if you're trying to do debugging or if you're just trying to do a side effect and you don't want it to affect anything. So this creates this new URL ID lookup. And then I have this catch error, so I can catch errors in our app. And then I subscribe to it because it's an observable. So once I subscribe to it, it'll emit this event, and it's basically like a stream of data. It'll do all these things, this stuff like in pluck and tap, and then I can set it to this.pokemons. Now, if you want to get out of this paradigm in Angular, they do have ways of doing that. You can actually turn this observable stream into a promise if you didn't want this, but I figured like really you should probably just keep it as a promise, or you probably should keep it as an observable, because if you convert it to a promise, then you lose a lot of this really cool functionality that you can do. And this is all a part of the RxJS library, and this is really integral into the Angular system. So let's talk about easy views. So Vue, I think Vue is probably the easiest framework to jump on. It's just very simple from the Vue CLI, the Vue UI, getting something up and running super easy. So it's really great for onboarding experience for new developers. You just really need to know HTML and CSS, and setting up like a data object and doing reactivity is really simple. So it's very little JavaScript. There are some guardrails and best practices you should follow though. So it does have an included Vue router. It does have some conventions that you should probably use, like the single file components, so that it kind of leads you in the right direction. There is some Vueisms that you need to know, like you need to know how to use directives in your HTML templates. There's a few things that you might have problems with if you're not familiar with that. But for the most part, it's really simple to use. On the other hand, Angular is great for if you have an organization and they're already using Java, they're already using C#, they're already familiar with this OOP paradigm, and you're having like back-end developers do front-end work. This is a great way to do it because you are going to have the same kind of back-end infrastructure as your front-end infrastructure, and you're both kind of having a common set of tools using classes and OOP, which is great. It does have a higher learning curve for sure. I mean, the first time you try to grab the router data and you have to like import in something into the constructor, and then you have to add something into the modules, like the app module, because things aren't working right and the errors may not make any sense to you at first. So you're definitely gonna have some higher learning curve. And then things like forms though are really well done in Angular, and they have a really well done library that's basically built in Angular to do reactive forms, template driven forms. The HTTP client library is top notch too. It's no reason to bring in Axios or Fetch because it's already built into the platform. And then TypeScript, just having it already there when you start your app means it's like a first-class citizen. It's going to be integrated in everything in the Angular ecosystem. If you use types and you're diligent about using types everywhere, you can really make a very sophisticated, very well-created app, I should say, that has very little bugs, because TypeScript itself is going to catch some of those bugs. It's not going to catch all of them, but it will catch some of them. And it'll make your job and your life easier, especially when first time you use IntelliSense and it's doing this auto completion of you, and you're like, oh, it's so much easier. And like I showed in the video I did with the Angular tutorial, you can have that same auto completion inside your templates too, and that is really neat. So conclusion, I have Vue and Angular. I left this blank, but in conclusion, I just want to say that Vue has a few great things about it. It has this very simple onboarding. It has really easy way of using directives. You don't have to learn classes or OOP, and it's pretty powerful. On the other hand, Angular has a little bit of a higher learning curve, but it has some really great things like reactive forms out of the box. It has a really good HTTP client library. Once you understand RxJS, because it has a little bit of a learning curve, you just love it. You'll be like, wow, why can't I do this with normal promises? There's just some really cool things you can do with it. You will get annoyed that you have to unsubscribe to everything after a while, especially if you use RxJS in a lot of places. Now, I didn't even touch on the state management systems between Angular and Vue. In Vue, they have something called Vuex, which I think is really easy to use. On Angular, you have a pretty hardcore NGRX, which is really close to, they're both Flux type systems, Flux type state management systems, but the Angular one with NGRX is really similar to what you see in a normal, typical React Redux system. So you are going to be dispatching a lot of actions. There's a lot of boilerplate. There's actually a few libraries out there and a few newer versions of Angular that made a little bit less boilerplate. But there's a lot of boilerplate, especially you're dealing with classes and everything. So I really think that Vuex wins out in the simplicity side of things. In conclusion, I would say if you're a new developer, I would definitely learn something like Vue first over Angular. However, though, I would say if you are a more experienced developer, you like classes, you like OOP, you're trying to learn a new framework, I think Angular is really, really powerful. And it's really a pleasure to work in too. Once you get really good at it and you're using TypeScript everywhere, it just makes a lot of sense. All right, so I hope that makes sense to you. I'm still definitely a huge Vue fanboy, but I can appreciate Angular and some of the cool things it has too. Once again, if you're beginning learning web development, definitely go to Vue. I think it's just a better way to go. But if you're a little more advanced and wanting to learn a new framework, I don't think Angular is bad as some people make it out to be. Let me know in the description what you guys think. I want to hear it. Thanks.